Welcome to week 3 of Business 525, Economics of Organizational Strategy. This is Professor Starr, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to hear me on a voice-over at least one of the weeks, as options for week 5 include having talking points in the notes section of the PowerPoint or doing voice recording like I'm doing today. I'm personally using Screencast-O-Matic, and then I'm uploading what I do to YouTube to make it easily accessible both in mobile and desktop format. So I'm going to work through the slides. You'll see that I have talking notes here as well if you're looking at the notes section, but as you follow me on the screen, I'm just going to kind of give you some of the information and give you a chance to also put a voice to the name at least. So what are the sources for competitive advantage for each of the 3 companies that we've looked at? That includes your target firm as well as the 2 key competitors that we picked out in the first week. How likely are they to stand the test of time? So as you think about the competitive advantages, we want to think about whether they're sustainable in the short term only or for a period of time before we think that those will easily be addressed by outside competitors, either by copying what we've done, imitating us, or through navigating around that element that's kind of set us apart. Now, you might think of Honest Tea founder had an advantage of no pre-assumptions, since when he started Honest Tea, he hadn't been in the beverage industry. He knew very little about the industry as a whole, let alone the specifics of brewing tea. As a result, he came to it with no pre-assumptions, or a different set of pre-assumptions than the industry as a whole typically has, since he knew nothing about that industry. And he had to innovate on very little capital because his resources were limited in comparison to his competitors. As a result, he approached business in a very different way, and he was able to carve out a market share based on those advantages. When we think about threats to sustainability, and you can go back and think through our readings on threats of imitation, threats of substitution, threats of hold-up, and threats of slack, just take a minute and discuss what you think each of these mean. And then I would encourage you to write down some of those key thoughts from our readings, and you can submit those kind of overview ideas. And as you think about those, would you answer the previous slide differently? Are there different sources of competitive advantage either for your target firm or one of the key competitors? And are there concerns as you look at those for your target company that there may be threats to imitation or substitution from those competitors, or threats of hold-up or slack? As you think about 3 companies, who's been mimicking or imitating whom within the industry? In particular, I want you to give some attention to how your firm has copied some of its competitors, been the follower, or where maybe they've been the leader and been imitated by the competition themselves. imitation increases the supply of what has up to this point made us unique. So it decreases our ability to capture profitability. It ends up making our business model more commonplace. And it can be really common and pervasive. In fact, when organizations look too different from what we expect within an industry, sometimes that causes us caution, trying to understand even what they are. And so it's common for companies in the same industry to have some similarity, but that you need some advantage, some way of standing out uniquely also to generate consistency amongst your customer base. So Apple getting copied in user-friendly computers, or maybe even more recently in the iPhone, Ben & Jerry's in super premium ice cream, and now there's a marketplace full of competitors as I look to pull ice cream out of the Wegmans freezer, or MySpace, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, social networking, Snapchat, and Pinterest, etc. By this point, I hope you've captured that wherever there's an orange background slide, there's something that I'm encouraging you, calling you to do. It also gives you an opportunity, either in class face-to-face or through an online submission, to share what you've been asked to do regarding that particular slide. So in terms of responses to imitation, early movers gain some advantages, often of economies of scale and scope. They are able to enhance learning, and there's information that they often have that isn't public domain at this stage. There's contract and relationships that can be established that give them some longevity. They do allow you to use, you have to respond to threats of retaliation. There's response and time lag on the part of competitors, and it does add to the strategic complexity, upgrading what you are doing. So if you're late, you're going to end up having to be better in some way. There can be advantages to being a second mover or a follower, and what I would like you to think a little bit about what the trade-offs might be in costs in being a first mover rather than a second mover. For example, R&D and the cost involved in that research and development. When something doesn't exist, going 0 to 1 or creating something that doesn't exist is much harder than adapting a 2.0 version of something. There's lots of mistakes that are made in learning. You may think about new tech and how that might change the coming landscape. And so take a few minutes and generate some specifics about how your firm and the two key competitors address imitation, and whether they tend to be first movers or quick responders or second movers, and what the advantages and disadvantages may be for each of those three companies. When we think about the threat of substitution, we recognize that substitution reduces the demand for what we uniquely provide. So where imitation increased the supply, substitution reduced the demand for it because customers, clients now have alternatives. It could be driven by change in technology, customer needs, input prices, the proverbial better mousetrap, or an alternative business model. We've seen that happen in our adult life as we've watched movie stores kind of come and go, and on demand and Netflix kind of replace that model. Substitution threats can be subtle and unexpected. Sometimes they kind of seem to pop up overnight, whether that's disposable contact lenses, whether that's Netflix pushing out Blockbuster. So are there substitutes for your industry? For example, K-Cups may be a substitute to Keurig, and Keurig, maybe a substitute to Starbucks. When we respond to substitution, there's a set of approaches or techniques we can use. We can ignore them. Maybe they're not important enough. Maybe they're not capturing enough market share for us to warrant giving it much attention. So we cannot respond. We can take a direct approach, fighting against it, and we can try to improve what we do and make the cost of switching from our products to another more challenging. And we can think about how to recombine services or features in order to stave off those substitutes, as well as straddling and harvesting. And so this risk management decision process is really what we're looking at. We have to do it all the time. We have to think about how we'll manage the potential of something, and when that potential risk, it's not guaranteed it will happen, but we recognize that there's a probability it will happen, and we take an approach based on that probability of it happening and the consequences should it happen. So we consider both those likelihoods. We spend lots of time worrying about what might never actually be, and so we want to give consideration to the probability, but also the consequences. I remember sitting in when Richard Sands was recognized as Rochester's Small Business Man of the Year, heading up Constellation Brands over in Fairport, but here in town. And they grow often through acquisition, which is a rare growth strategy and often fails. It's a very difficult growth strategy, but they never bet the ship on one acquisition, is what he shared. That they make sure that when they acquire a new product, that they are doing so in a way that protects the existing company, that if the acquisition turns out not to be a good one, which he had cases and examples of that for the company, that while that is a difficulty to be overcome, it doesn't impact the whole organization. They can lick their wounds and move on. So how does your firm, and again, how do the two key competitors address substitutes? The reason we keep coming back to these competitors is if we can think through their lens, if we can see the industry not just from our own company, but from these two companies' lenses as well, it will give us a fuller picture of the industry, and it will allow us to advise the firm that you are working on even better, because you can garner those best practices and those things that are unique and maybe set apart the competitors, and they can begin to better understand how to respond. So again, thinking from those three competitors' standpoint, I'd like you to spend a little time thinking about how they address substitution, who they are, and maybe they address it differently in some cases and similarly in others.